The yellowish light spilled down from old industrial lamps hanging on rusted beams, flickering like a weary breath. Inside the Clearwater County auction barn, the ceiling fans groaned in slow circles, too weak to chase away the late August heat. Dust from dry hay floated in the air, suspended like disturbed memories above the scarred wooden floor. The smell of sweat, rusted iron from the stall doors, and stale cigarette smoke clinging to men's jackets blended into one heavy atmosphere. The horse auction was unfolding as it had every summer, but the room no longer carried energy or excitement. Rows of folding chairs were filled with faces hardened by mountain wind and years of labor. Each nod, each shake of the head was performed like an old ritual. Hank Miller, the veteran auctioneer, stood at the center with his familiar gavel. Once, his voice had cracked like a drum, fast and commanding, but now it rasped, tired, as the ceiling fans above. "Lot number 34, he called, his voice hoarse. "Dark bay mare, not young, not sound, but she's still got heart." The words echoed across the room, but dropped into silence. From behind the gate, a mare limped forward. Every step pulled her right foreleg slightly behind, each landing a memory of an injury that had never healed. The light caught her dull coat, ribs faintly showing beneath it. A thin white blaze ran down her forehead to the bridge of her nose like a frozen bolt of lightning. She held her head high, not with pride, but with a quiet defiance. Her ears flicked, her body tense, but it was her eyes, those eyes that unsettled the room. They weren't pleading, they weren't broken, they were older, deeper, as if asking whether anyone left in this barn still had the courage to look back. The audience muttered, then fell silent. Heads shook, boots scraped, not one hand rose. At the far end of the room, Sam Whitaker leaned against the doorframe, half his face caught in the yellow light. He hadn't planned on stepping inside. For years, Sam had avoided places like this, avoided people, avoided memory. But those eyes, they dragged him forward. Sam was 55, hair silvering too soon, beard left uneven on his chin. His jeans were worn thin, his cowboy hat frayed at the edges, an heirloom from his father. In town, they whispered about him. The once beloved English teacher, widowed too young, whose only daughter Lily vanished one summer night at the county fair. Since then, silence had become his companion. He carried it the way a deaf man learns to live, with the constant ringing in his ears. But tonight, as the lame mare stepped into the barn, silence turned into something sharper, a drumbeat pounding inside his chest. 100? Hank tried again, his voice bouncing hollow against the rafters. Still, no one moved. The mare, instead of retreating, stamped once. It wasn't strong, but it was deliberate, a claim that she existed. Her eyes turned toward the door, toward Sam. And in that instant, he saw himself. Every morning for years, stepping into another day, not out of eagerness, but out of a brittle will to keep breathing. His chest tightened. He saw Lily. Saw her at 12, riding a shaggy pony along the Yellowstone River, her laughter spilling into the summer air, ribbon flashing in her hair. Saw her at 17, sitting on the porch, scribbling furiously in her journal, eyes carrying something he had been too tired to notice. And he saw her that final night, stepping into the lights of the fairground and never coming home. 50. Hank dropped the price, desperation under his tone. Still, no hands. Sam drew a breath. He hadn't come here to buy. He barely had money. His farm sat empty, just enough to keep him alive. But those eyes, the refusal in them, pulled him forward, each step against the weight of his own reluctance. His boots thudded across the boards. Heads turned. Someone whispered his name. A few smirked with pity. He stopped at the rail, only feet from the mare. She swung her head toward him, their eyes locked. Silence thickened. Hank's voice lifted with hope. "Looks like we've got some interest. Mr. Whitaker, you want a bid?" Sam didn't answer. He placed one hand on the cold rail, gaze fixed on the mare. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like suffocation. It felt like possibility. But he didn't raise his hand, didn't say mine. He stood frozen as Hank sighed, dropped the gavel, and closed the lot on the horse nobody wanted. Sam turned and walked out, yet he felt the mare's eyes follow him into the night. Darkness fell quick in Montana. Back at his cabin, Sam lay on the old bed, the ceiling fan clattering above. He couldn't sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the blaze down her face, the limp step, the eyes that refused surrender. He rose, poured black coffee, stared out into the unlit yard. The house was still, only crickets filling the night. For the first time in years, he realized he didn't feel completely alone. Somewhere out there, in a strange pen, that mare still stood, still breathing, still waiting. By morning, the pickup was rolling down the dirt road before Sam fully admitted it to himself. He told his conscience it was just a drive, just to see. But he knew. Silence had already cracked. The lot was nearly empty now. Most trailers were gone. Only a few unwanted animals tied along the fence. And among them, she still stood. Head low, thin body upright. Waiting. Hope. The word came unbidden into his mind, as if it had always been her name. Hank Miller came shuffling out, clipboard under one arm, giving Sam a half-amused, half-sympathetic look. "Back again, huh? Thought you were just watching." Sam didn't answer. He stepped closer. The mare lifted her head, ears twitching, eyes locked on his. In that instant, he could almost hear a voice. "You going to let it slip away again?" His throat tightened. He remembered Lily, how he hadn't heard her when she needed him most, how silence had already cost him once. This time, he couldn't walk away. He nodded. "I'll take her." Hank's brows shot up, then softened into a smile. "Well, she's got a home then." Sam signed the papers, his hand trembling slightly. When Hank passed him the lead rope, Sam realized this wasn't just a purchase. It was a surrender to something larger than himself. The mare Hope followed him, limping but steady, into the trailer. And under the new light of morning, Sam felt for the first time in years that the silence inside his chest had cracked, letting through the thinnest blade of light. But as he tightened the straps, his eyes caught on the old saddle thrown over the fence. Leather cracked, stitching uneven, the seat bearing deep wear from whoever had ridden it. Something about the underside looked wrong, the seam stitched clumsily, as if hiding a repair. Sam froze, reached out. His fingertips brushed the rough seam, and a chill crawled his spine. He turned his head. Hope was watching him, ears forward, eyes steady, as if urging him, "Open it." The gravel road snaked away behind Sam's truck, dust rising in long, pale ribbons under the summer Sunday. The trailer rattled on the hitch, the mare inside shifting her weight with each bump. Sam drove with both hands tight on the wheel, jaw clenched, unsure if he'd just made the most foolish or the only necessary decision left in his life. The farmhouse appeared as it always did, slouched against the Montana horizon, paint peeling from its boards, windows filmed with dust. The barn behind it sagged, shingles missing, doors hanging like tired eyelids. This land had once thrummed with life, Lily's laughter echoing off the porch, Anna's voice humming as she shelled peas by the window. Now, it was only echoes and weeds. Sam parked by the barn, killed the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, listening to the tick of cooling metal, his heart thudding louder than the silence around him. Then he slid out, boots crunching gravel, and walked back to the trailer. Hope stood inside, ears flicking, head high despite the limp in her leg. The heat shimmered on her coat, dull but stubborn. Sam opened the gate slowly. "Come on, girl," he murmured, voice low, uncertain. She hesitated, nostrils flaring, then stepped carefully down the ramp. Her hooves struck the dirt with uneven rhythm. She scanned the barren yard with dark, steady eyes, as if measuring whether this broken place could be called home. Sam led her toward the barn. Inside, the air was thick with the musk of dust and old hay. Pigeons burst from the rafters, wings clattering like loose boards. The stalls hadn't held an animal in years, but one was still solid enough. He spread fresh hay, filled the trough with water from the pump. Hope entered without protest, lowering her head to sniff the straw. Her limp showed in every shift of weight, but her spine stayed straight, her gaze unflinching. Sam leaned on the rail, hands awkward, like a man relearning how to speak. He whispered the name that had taken hold of him at the auction. Hope. Her ears twitched. She lifted her head, eyes fixing on him, as if recognizing the vow in his voice. Sam stayed with her until dusk, brushing cobwebs from the tack box in the corner. The old saddle lay on a bench nearby. Its leather was cracked, edges frayed, stirrup straps worn nearly through. He couldn't throw it aside. Something about it tugged at him the way a book draws the hand, even before the first page is opened. He ran his palm along the seat, feeling indentations pressed deep by years of riders. Then his fingers caught the seam. Uneven, wrong, the stitching newer than the rest. His breath hitched. Slowly, he pried it loose. A small cloth pouch slipped out, no bigger than his palm. The ribbon binding it was faded blue, almost gray with age. Sam's knees weakened. He knew that ribbon. Lily had worn it in her hair the morning of her last recital, the bow crooked as she rushed to hug him before stepping onto stage. He sat down hard on the bench, the pouch trembling in his hands. For a long time, he didn't open it. The air in the barn seemed to hum, alive with hope shifting in her stall, her gaze pinned on him as though she knew what he held. Finally, with fingers that felt foreign to him, Sam loosened the ribbon. A notebook slid out. Its cover was scuffed, corners bent, pages yellowed by time. Across the front, In handwriting he would have recognized anywhere was a single word: Lily. The barn tilted around him, his throat closed. He flipped the cover. Round, uneven letters pressed deep into the page. If I ever disappear, trust hope. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He clutched the notebook to his chest, as if pressing it hard enough might bring her voice through the paper into his heart. Hope nickered softly, stamping her good leg once. Sam turned toward her. She left this with you? His voice rasped. The mare lowered her head, blinked slowly, almost like an answer. Sam bowed over the notebook, grief and wonder colliding inside him. For years he had begged the silence for a sign. Any sign that Lily hadn't simply vanished into nothing. And here it was tucked beneath a saddle no one else had bothered to look at. He loosened the pouch further. A small scrap of embroidered cloth fell into his hand, stitched with crooked flowers. He remembered the summer Lily had sat on the porch teaching herself embroidery, declaring with her stubborn grin, "Poetry needs pictures too." A sound broke from Sam's chest, half sob, half laugh. Hope shifted closer in her stall, ears forward, her presence anchoring him. Sam crossed to her, extending his hand again. This time, she didn't pull away. Her muzzle brushed his palm, warm and soft, steadying him in a way no words could. "I don't know what she carried in you," he whispered, "but you carried it here." The oil lamp burned low, the barn filled with shadows that stretched long across the beams. Sam stayed there, notebook against his chest, hope breathing beside him, until the night pressed him back toward the empty farmhouse. He couldn't sleep. The fan groaned above his bed, each creak pulling him back to the words etched on yellowed paper. "If I ever disappear, trust hope." At dawn, gray light filtered through the curtains. He sat at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold, the notebook open before him. His thumb traced Lily's handwriting. "Dad, sometimes the world feels too heavy. People smile, but their eyes don't. I hear things I'm not supposed to hear. Whispers. I don't know who to tell. But hope listens without asking questions." Sam pressed his palm against the page, his eyes burned. He remembered Lily at 13, her laughter quicksilver, her questions relentless. Later at 17, distant, shadows under her eyes, he had convinced himself were only adolescence. Now he saw how wrong he had been. The next page was smudged, ink blurred by what looked like a tear. "If I vanish, follow the whispers. They will lead you to the truth." The words shook in his vision. He shut the notebook gently, as if it might break. Outside, the fields lay brittle under the rising Sunday. He looked out the window toward the barn. Hope stood in the corral, blaze of white catching morning light. She lifted her head as though waiting. Sam breathed deep, steadying himself. For years, survival had meant silence. But now, silence carried a message. Now, silence was no longer safe. That afternoon, Dr. Claire Benson's pickup rolled into the yard, dust trailing behind. She was a vet in her 30s, braid tucked under a ball cap, jeans streaked with mud. She leaned on the truck door, watching Hope limp in the corral. "She's not sound," Claire said, "but she's steady. You picked a hard road." Sam shrugged, notebook heavy in his pocket. "She came with something I couldn't ignore." Claire tilted her head, studying him. "Sometimes the ones nobody wants are the ones that save you." Her words lingered after she drove off. Sam leaned against the fence, watching Hope graze with uneven rhythm, and wondered if Claire knew more than she'd said. That night, he returned to the barn with the lamp. He opened the notebook again, heart hammering. Another page. "The fair is loud, but whispers are louder." He was there again. "I can't write his name. No one would believe me." Sam's breath hitched. The letters slanted, hurried, jagged. Hope shifted, her eyes catching the lamplight, steady and watchful. Sam closed the notebook slowly, pressing it flat against the bench. His pulse pounded in his ears. Whispers. A man she couldn't name. The night of the county fair. He gripped the bench until his knuckles whitened. He had avoided that night for years, telling himself Lily's disappearance was a mystery with no answer. But here it was, scribbled in her own hand. The silence he had lived under wasn't emptiness. It was protection. Someone's protection. Sam lifted his gaze to Hope. Her ears flicked, her body still, as though waiting for him to choose. Outside, the wind rattled the barn doors. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Sam whispered into the shadows. "What truth were you trying to carry back to me, Lily?" Hope breathed against the wood, warm and steady. And in the hush of the barn, Sam realized the next step would no longer let him remain hidden. The whispers weren't fading, they were calling. Sam clutched the notebook, Lily's words echoing. "Follow the whispers, they will lead you to the truth." Through the barn's open slats, he saw the lights of Clearwater flicker faint in the valley below. The fair banners would be rising soon, bright colors masking old shadows. He stood in the dark, one hand resting on hope's blaze. If Lily's words were real, and God help him, they felt more real than anything in years, then the town itself was part of the secret. He whispered to Hope, voice trembling but steady. Then, we go to town, we listen. Her ears twitched, as if agreeing. Outside, the night pressed close, and somewhere in the valley, a whisper waited to be heard. The highway into Clearwater cut through fields the color of brittle straw, broken only by barbed wire fences and sagging barns. Sam's old Ford rattled over the asphalt, the notebook riding heavy in his jacket pocket. Hope's words no. Lily's words pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. If I vanish, follow the whispers. The town lay ahead, small and stubborn against the sweep of Montana sky. It was a place where everyone knew every face, where silence carried more weight than words. For years, Sam had avoided it. Every storefront, every church pew, every diner seat carried the shadow of Lily's absence. To walk its streets again was to peel back scars that had hardened over a decade. He parked on Main Street, the old truck shuddering as he cut the engine. Life moved around him in small-town rhythms. A bicycle clattering past, the clang of the diner doorbell, country music leaking from a hardware store radio. Yet the air felt taut, as though holding its breath. Sam stepped out, boots heavy on the sidewalk. Eyes flicked his way, a nod here, a murmur there, but no one lingered. People bent their heads back to their errands, pretending not to notice him, pretending not to remember. He pushed into Dot's diner, the bell above the door chiming too brightly. Conversation faltered. For half a second, the room froze, forks suspended, voices clipped. Then chatter resumed, lighter, as though nothing had happened. Dot herself, apron dusted with flour, glanced his way. "Coffee?" she asked, her tone too brisk, her eyes too soft. Sam nodded. He slid into a booth by the window. The vinyl seat creaked. Outside, kids laughed as they ran past, but in here, the silence clung like a film. He stirred cream into the dark liquid, listening. Two ranchers at the corner booth leaned in close, their words cut low, meant to be buried beneath the clatter of cutlery. Thought she ran off with friends? Never came back though, did she? Best not stir it up. Sam's knuckles whitened around the mug. The whispers were here, alive. He rose, left a crumpled bill on the counter, and pushed out into the street. Clearwater looked the same, yet different. Storefronts painted fresh, but the cracks still visible beneath. Flyers lined the bulletin board outside the feed store church potlucks, legal seminars, ads for insurance. Protect your family. Plan ahead. A town surface, tidy as a quilt, sewn tight to cover what no one dared speak. Sam walked past the Clearwater Library, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of boots. Through the window, he glimpsed rows of books, sunlight catching dust motes like drifting snow. Memory hit him like a fist. Lily curled in a chair, two small hands clutching novels meant for adults, eyes fierce with hunger for stories. She had once looked up at him and said, "Books don't lie, Dad. People do." His chest burned. He kept walking. At the corner, he nearly collided with Mark Holloway. The man had aged, hair thinned, belly softened, but Sam still recognized the once boyish smile that now faltered into guilt. "Sam," Mark said, voice low. Sam's jaw tightened. They had been close once, fellow teachers, neighbors, Sunday poker companions. But after Lily vanished, Mark had stopped coming around. Most people had. Mark shifted his weight. "Good to see you in town." Sam only stared. Something unspoken passed between them, regret, shame, fear. Mark opened his mouth as if to say more, but then closed it, shaking his head. "Take care," he muttered, before walking off. Sam turned, and that's when he saw him. Across the square, standing tall beside a gleaming black pickup, was Rick Dalton. The rancher carried himself with the assurance of a man who owned more than land. He owned loyalty, silence, power. His silver hair was combed back, shirt pressed, boots polished. He was talking to the sheriff, laughter rolling smooth as whiskey. But his eyes, when they found Sam across the street, went sharp. The smile never left his face, but the weight behind it told another story. Sam's breath caught. His hand instinctively brushed the notebook inside his jacket. Dalton tipped his hat with practiced charm, then turned back to the sheriff, the gesture casual. But Sam saw the crack beneath the flicker of recognition, of warning. The whispers weren't just rumor, they were orbiting him. Sam spent the afternoon drifting through town like a ghost. He heard pieces everywhere, voices cutting off when he passed, eyes sliding away, silence speaking louder than conversation. At the hardware store, two men argued about feed prices. then went quiet as he approached. At the post office, a clerk fumbled envelopes, gaze darting to the side. At the church bulletin board, he caught the tail end of a sentence. Best not bring it up around Dalton. Each moment was a thread, alone, meaningless. Together, they wove the outline of something Lily had tried to tell him. By dusk, Sam sat on a bench outside the closed barber shop, staring at the fading fair banners strung along Main Street. Bright cloth in red, white, and blue flapped in the evening wind. The county fair was days away, the same fair where Lily had vanished. His pulse thudded. The whispers circled back, always, to that night. Hope's words echoed again in his head. Trust Hope. Follow the whispers. The sky bruised purple. Streetlights buzzed on. Sam rose, walked back to his truck. The drive home was long and silent. Gravel popped beneath the tires. Out in the valley, fields lay dark beneath the rising moon. But when he turned onto the dirt road leading to his farm, his stomach clenched. A black pickup was idling by his mailbox, its headlights cut sharp against the dust. For a moment, neither vehicle moved. Sam's hands tightened on the wheel, his heart hammered. Then the pickup rolled forward slowly, deliberately, and past him. The driver's face was shadowed, but the brand on the door was clear enough. Dalton Ranch. The taillights disappeared into the night. Sam pulled into his drive, gravel spraying, and sat for a long moment gripping the steering wheel. The notebook weighed against his chest. Hope nickered from the barn, a low sound, steady but alert. The whispers weren't just in town. They had followed him home. Sam stepped out of the truck, moonlight spilling silver across the yard. Hope stood by the fence, ears pricked toward the road. Sam whispered, more to himself than to her. He knows I'm listening. Hope pawed the ground, her blaze catching the light like a warning flame. From somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder rolled low, a storm building in the dark. And in the silence between heartbeats, Sam knew someone would come knocking. The storm rolled in before midnight. Thunder cracked across the valley, shaking the old farmhouse's windows in their frames. Rain hammered the tin roof of the barn, streaming down in silver sheets. Sam sat at the kitchen table, a single lamp burning, the notebook open before him like a wound. If I vanish, follow the whispers. His thumb traced the faded blue ribbon again and again, as if the thread itself might carry Lily's touch. The house creaked with wind. He had lived with storms all his life, but tonight the walls felt thinner, the silence heavier. A knock startled him, soft at first, then harder, insistent against the storm. Sam froze, chair legs scraping the floor as he rose. Few people ever came this far down the road, even fewer at this hour. He opened the door. Mark Holloway stood there, rain dripping from his hat, face drawn tight with something between fear and guilt. "Can I come in?" Mark's voice was rough, shaking. Sam hesitated, then stepped aside. Mark entered, water pooling on the wooden floor beneath his boots. He removed his hat with trembling hands and clutched it to his chest. For a long moment neither man spoke, the storm filling the silence. Finally, Mark sank into a chair. His eyes, once quick with easy laughter, were hollow now. He rubbed his palms together as though trying to wash something off. "I should have come sooner," he said. "A long time ago." Sam folded his arms, his chest tight. He had no interest in small talk. "Then say it!" Mark's throat worked. He stared at the lamp's flame, as if gathering courage from its flicker. "The night of the fair," he began. His voice cracked. "I saw Lily." Sam's breath stopped, his pulse pounded in his ears. "She wasn't alone," Mark continued, voice breaking. "She was with Rick Dalton." The name struck like lightning. Sam gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles whitening. "You saw them?" Mark nodded, rainwater dripping from his chin. "By the livestock barns, after dark." She looked different, scared. He was too close. I told myself it was nothing. She was 17. He was respected. Who was I to interfere? His voice faltered. "I should have stepped in. I didn't." Rage surged hot in Sam's chest. "And you stayed silent for 10 years? Mark's face crumpled. "I was afraid. He had power, money, friends in every office. I told myself if I spoke up, no one would believe me. But every time I saw you, every time I saw that empty seat at church, I felt it eating me alive." He looked up, eyes wet. "I can't carry it anymore." Sam slammed his fist against the table. The lamp rattled, shadows trembling on the walls. "She wrote about it," Sam said, voice raw. He shoved the notebook across the table, pages open to Lily's jagged scrawl. He was there again. "I can't write his name. No one would believe me." Mark stared at the words, his lips moving silently as he read. His shoulders slumped as if the truth had finally dropped its full weight on him. "God help me," he whispered. "She tried to tell you." "She tried," Sam choked. And we both failed her. The two men sat in the storm's roar, silence stretching heavy between them. Finally, Mark buried his face in his hands. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know. Sam turned away, chest heaving. He stared out the window where rain streaked the glass. In the barn beyond, Hope shifted in her stall, head lifted against the thunder. She was steady, enduring, the only steady thing left. You saw her, Sam said, voice low but steady. And you chose yourself over her? Mark's silence was answer enough. Sam let it hang there. His anger was fire, but beneath it, something else burned resolve. When Mark finally rose to leave, he looked smaller, diminished. Be careful, he murmured. Dalton doesn't forgive. And if he knows you're digging? His voice trailed off. Sam didn't answer. He followed him to the door, watched as Mark vanished into the rain. Left alone, Sam returned to the table. His hands trembled as he opened the notebook again. The pages blurred under his tears, but Lily's words cut sharp as ever. Follow the whispers. They will lead you to the truth. Michael's confession was no longer a whisper. It was a voice cracked with regret, pointing directly at the man Sam had once called a friend, Dalton. Sam shut the notebook with care, pressing his palm flat against the cover as if sealing a promise. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, something steadier had formed. He was no longer lost in silence. The path forward was narrow, dangerous, but it existed. He rose, went to the barn. Hope lifted her head as he entered, ears twitching at the thunder. Sam stroked her blaze, voice shaking but sure. He knows something. He's hiding it, and I'm done hiding too. Hope pressed her muzzle against his hand, warm breath steady against his skin. For the first time, Sam felt like he wasn't standing alone at the edge of the storm. The rain eased by morning, leaving the valley drenched and shining under weak sunlight. Sam walked the yard with the notebook tucked under his arm, Dalton's name burning on his tongue. He knew where he had to go. Dalton's ranch. The place was a fortress of wealth and respectability, but beneath its fresh paint, he now saw rot. Sam tightened his grip on the notebook. Next time, I look him in the eye, he whispered. Hope snorted, pawing the wet earth, as though answering. From the ridge road, a black pickup appeared, crawling slow, its engine too quiet. Sam's jaw set. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were watching. The Dalton ranch stretched wide across the valley, acres of rolling pasture fenced in with new rails gleaming white under the Montana Sunday. The house sat at its heart, sprawling and polished, its veranda wrapped like arms in false welcome. Trucks lined the driveway, each shining, each an emblem of wealth and control. Sam's old Ford pulled up in stark contrast, rust flaking, engine coughing as it died. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, hands gripping the notebook on the seat beside him. His pulse pounded. His whole body told him to turn back. But Lily's words pressed against him. If I vanish, trust Hope. And Mark's broken voice haunted him. She was with Rick Dalton. Sam opened the door and stepped into the gravel. Rick Dalton himself appeared on the porch, broad shoulders filling the doorway. He wore a pressed white shirt tucked into jeans, boots polished to a mirror shine. His smile was practiced, a politician's mask. Well, well, Dalton called, his voice rolling easy. If it isn't Sam Whitaker, been a while since you came around. Sam walked up the path, notebook under his arm. I didn't come for pleasantries. Dalton's smile flickered, then held. Then come in. We'll talk like men. Inside, the ranch house gleamed with polished wood and trophies, ribbons, photos, mounted heads. The Dalton legacy stared from every wall, a museum of power. Dalton poured 2 glasses of bourbon, sliding one across the counter. You look rough, Sam. Still rattling around that old place by yourself? Sam didn't touch the glass. He set the notebook down between them. You knew Lily. Dalton's hand paused on his own glass. A subtle pause, gone in a blink. He chuckled low. Everybody knew Lily, sweet girl, shame what happened. Sam's voice sharpened. Mark saw you with her that night, at the fair. The air thickened. Dalton leaned back, sipping his drink, eyes cool. People see what they want. Mark drinks more than he admits. You know that. Sam slammed his palm against the notebook. She wrote about you. Right here. She said no one would believe her. Dalton's eyes narrowed, a crack in the mask. But his voice stayed smooth. Careful, Sam. Grief makes a man imagine ghosts. Don't go hanging blame on me because you can't face losing her. Rage burned through Sam, but he forced it steady. You don't scare me anymore. Dalton chuckled, shaking his head. You think marching up here with a dusty journal makes you a hero? You've been gone too long, Whitaker. This town doesn't care what you think. They care about my cattle, feeding their families, my money paying their wages, my name on their school board. You're a ghost no one listens to. Sam leaned forward, voice low and steady. Ghosts don't stay buried. For the first time, Dalton's jaw tightened. He set his glass down hard enough to crack the silence. I'll tell you this once. Drop it. Go back to your barn, to that half-dead nag you bought. Leave the past where it belongs, or you'll regret it. Sam stood, gripping the notebook. I've lived with regret long enough. I'm not adding silence to it. Dalton's smile vanished entirely. His eyes were cold steel now. Then you'd better watch your back. Sam walked out of the ranch house with his heart hammering, legs trembling with fury. The sunlight outside hit like a slap. He climbed into his truck, the notebook heavy on the seat beside him. In the rearview mirror, he saw Dalton standing at the window, watching, not smiling. The road back to his farm felt longer than usual. Each bend carried the weight of Dalton's warning. Each mile pressed the truth harder into him. Dalton wasn't just a shadow in Lily's writing. He was flesh and blood, and he was scared. Fear meant weakness. Fear meant truth. When Sam pulled into his driveway, Hope lifted her head from the corral, ears pricked. He walked to her, resting his forehead against her blaze. Her breath washed steady over him. He's hiding something, Sam whispered. But he slipped. I saw it. Hope stamped once, the sound sharp against the earth. Sam opened the notebook again that evening. By lamplight, he studied Lily's words. In one margin, she had doodled nothing elaborate, just a quick sketch of a sign, a logo. His breath caught. Dalton Feeds. The very brand painted on Dalton's trucks. Sam leaned back, the pieces colliding. She had written about whispers. She had feared writing his name. But she had left this proof, in her own hand, pointing at him. The storm outside had passed, but Sam knew another was building. That night, he drafted a letter. He photocopied the notebook pages. He wrote an anonymous note and mailed it to the Bozeman Gazette. He sent a copy to the town pastor. His hands shook with both fear and relief as the envelope slid into the slot. For the first time in a decade, he felt like the silence was breaking, but it didn't take long for the response. The following evening, as Sam sat at his table with a cup of coffee, a crash shattered the window. Glass sprayed across the kitchen. A rock skidded across the floor, paper tied to it. Sam's pulse roared. He bent, untied the paper. 3 words scrawled in black marker. Stop, or else. He looked out into the dark, but only rain-soaked night stared back. Hope whinnied from the barn, a sharp, nervous sound. Sam clenched the paper in his fist. His fear was real, but so was his resolve. Later, as he swept the glass from the floor, the phone rang. A sound he hadn't heard in weeks, maybe months. He lifted the receiver, heart pounding. Static hissed. Then, faintly, a voice. Dad? Sam's knees nearly buckled. He gripped the counter with his free hand. Lily? He whispered. But the line went dead. He stood frozen in the kitchen, receiver pressed to his ear, the word Dad echoing through him like thunder. Outside, Hope called again, restless in the dark. Sam whispered into the silence. She's alive. And for the first time, the whispers felt like they were speaking directly to him. The phone's dead tone buzzed in Sam's ear long after he'd lowered it. His hand trembled around the receiver. One word still rang inside him, louder than the storm, louder than his fear. Dad. He stared at the phone on the counter, as though it might come alive again. The silence pressed heavy, interrupted only by Hope's restless cries from the barn. He wanted to believe it had been real, that Lily was alive, somewhere, reaching for him. But he also knew how dangerous Hope could be. He pressed his palms against the counter, eyes burning. What if it was a trick? What if it was Dalton, taunting him? But no. That voice thin with static, trembling it had been hers, his daughter's. Sam turned toward the table where the notebook lay open. He placed the receiver beside it, as if both objects were proof of the impossible. Lily was still out there. The next morning dawned gray, the valley wet from another night of rain. Sam didn't sleep. He sat on the porch as the mist lifted, the notebook in his lap. When a truck rattled into the yard, his body tensed. It was Dr. Claire Benson. She stepped down from her pickup, carrying a medical kit. Heard you've been housing a horse no one else wanted, she said lightly, though her eyes studied him close. Sam nodded toward the barn. She's in there. Inside, Claire knelt by Hope's injured leg, her hands gentle but efficient. The joint's bad, she murmured. Old injury. She won't run barrels or pull cattle again, but she'll walk. She'll endure. Sam stroked Hope's neck, the mare's breath steady under his hand. She already carried more than her share. Claire glanced up, curiosity flickering. You talk like she's got secrets. Sam hesitated, then slid the notebook across the hay. Claire opened it, her brows knitting as she read. Sam, she whispered. This is Lily's? His throat tightened. He nodded. Claire read silently for a while, then shut the notebook gently. You can't keep this to yourself. If Dalton's involved— Sam cut her off, voice low. I sent copies. To the Gazette, to the pastor. He looked at her, eyes fierce. If something happens to me, the truth won't die with me. Claire's expression hardened. Then you'd better prepare, because if Dalton feels cornered— She didn't finish the sentence. A sharp knock startled them both. Mark Holloway stood in the doorway, face pale. He held out a small device. You need to see this. It was a USB drive, its casing worn. Where'd you get it? Sam asked. Mark's voice trembled. A student gave it to me years ago. Said Lily asked him to hold on to it, said it mattered. I kept it hidden. I was too afraid to look. Until now. Sam's hands shook as he plugged it into the old laptop. The screen flickered, then filled with images, grainy photos, time-stamped. Lily at the county fair, face half lit by neon. And beside her, unmistakable even through the blur, Rick Dalton, his hand on her shoulder. Sam's breath caught. Claire swore softly under hers. Photo after photo clicked across the screen. Lily laughing nervously, Dalton leaning close, his face shadowed with something wrong. The last file was a short video. The footage shook, as if Lily herself had held the camera low. Voices filled the tiny speakers. Dalton's voice. No one will believe you. Not over me. Sam slammed the laptop shut, heart thundering. That's it, he said. That's the truth. Mark's face drained of color. Sam, you don't understand. If he knows you have this— As if on cue, a sharp crack split the air. Glass shattered. The barn window exploded inward, shards raining down. Hope screamed, hooves pounding against the stall. Sam hit the dirt floor, dragging Claire with him. Mark ducked, hands over his head. Outside, the roar of an engine echoed, then faded into the distance. Sam's ears rang. He crawled to Hope's stall, running his hands along her trembling body. No blood, just glass. He pressed his forehead to her blaze, whispering steady words until her breath slowed. Then he rose, fists clenched. The note from last night still burning in his memory. Stop, or else. They weren't whispers anymore. They were threats. That night, Sam sat at the kitchen table, the USB drive clutched in his palm. He couldn't shake Dalton's words in the video. No one will believe you. He looked at Claire, seated across from him, eyes fierce. Do you believe it? She met his gaze without flinching. I believe Lily, and I believe you. Mark sat hunched, guilt written into every line of him. Sam, if you release this, Dalton will come for you harder. He's got friends in the sheriff's office. He's got money. Sam slammed his fist against the table. Then let him come. I've been living like a dead man for 10 years. He can't take more from me than he already has. Hope whinnied from the barn, her voice carrying through the night air. Sam's chest rose with resolve. Tomorrow, I take this to the pastor, to the town. Let them hear Lily's voice with their own ears. But the storm wasn't done with him. At midnight, as Sam walked the porch, a shadow moved by the tree line. He froze, hand tightening on the rifle by the door. A figure lingered, too still, too silent, watching. Show yourself, Sam barked. The shadow melted back into the dark. Only the sound of crickets answered. Sam lowered the rifle slowly, his blood still roaring. When he turned, he saw the notebook lying open on the porch table. The last page he had read days earlier glared up at him. If I vanish, don't stop listening. Even silence has echoes. His breath caught. Had Lily known it would come to this? The next morning, church bells rang faint in the valley. The town would gather at Clearwater Chapel, the place where Dalton still held sway. Sam stood by his truck, the USB in one pocket, the notebook in the other. Hope stood at the fence, ears forward, as though urging him onward. He whispered, voice ragged. It's time they heard the truth. But as he slid into the driver's seat, his phone buzzed. A voicemail alert blinked. He pressed play. Lily's voice, faint but clear, filled the cab. Dad, don't trust anyone, especially him. The message cut to static. Sam's stomach turned cold. Him. But which him? Dalton? Or someone closer? He gripped the wheel as the chapel bell tolled louder, summoning him to a truth that might destroy everything. Sunday morning settled over Clearwater in a hush. The storm had passed, but clouds still clung low to the mountains, gray and heavy. The bell at Clearwater Chapel rang across the valley, its sound gathering the town in slow, reluctant waves. Sam drove in with his truck rattling, the notebook in his jacket, the USB in his pocket. Each toll of the bell felt like a hammer against his ribs. He hadn't walked into this church since the week after Lily disappeared. Back then, people had offered him soft words, casseroles, and empty prayers. Then the whispers had started. She ran away. She was wild. Maybe she chose to leave. Today he wasn't coming for casseroles. He was coming to break the silence. The chapel's white paint was peeling, its steeple leaning slightly, but the pews filled just the same. Ranchers in pressed shirts, mothers with restless children, old men nodding greetings. Their conversations hushed when Sam stepped inside. Heads turned, eyes followed. Sam met them head on, shoulders squared, his boots striking the worn floorboards. He sat halfway down, directly across from Rick Dalton. Dalton looked immaculate. His silver hair glowed under stained glass light, his smile practiced as he shook hands and whispered blessings. When his gaze met Sam's, the smile didn't falter, but the steel behind it sharpened. The pastor cleared his throat at the pulpit. "Welcome, friends. Let us gather in fellowship." His voice trembled slightly, as though he, too, felt the weight of the air. Hymns rose, voices uneven. Sam didn't sing. His hand stayed on the notebook in his jacket, his eyes on Dalton. Each verse about mercy felt like a blade twisted in hypocrisy. When the final hymn ended, Sam rose. His boots echoed down the aisle. Murmurs rippled. "Pastor," Sam said, his voice steady, though his chest burned. "Before you preach, the town needs to hear something." The pastor froze, his eyes flicking to Dalton. Dalton leaned back in his pew, arms folded, smile tight. Sam turned to face the congregation. He pulled the USB drive from his pocket, held it high. "Lily tried to tell us. She wrote it down. She left this behind, and now her voice speaks again." Gasps rustled through the pews. The pastor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Bring it here." Sam stepped forward, sliding the drive into the chapel's small projector system. The screen behind the pulpit flickered, then filled with grainy images. Lily at the fair, laughing, nervous, Dalton beside her, his hand heavy on her shoulder. A ripple of unease moved through the pews. People leaned forward, whispers breaking loose. Then the video played. Shaky footage. Dalton's voice, low and unmistakable. "No one will believe you. Not over me." The chapel went still. Sam's chest thundered. He turned, voice raw. "She was 17. My daughter. And you all chose silence." Eyes darted. Mothers clutched children. Men looked at the floor. Dalton rose slowly, his mask slipping. "This is slander," Dalton said, voice smooth but sharp. "Old footage, taken out of context. You think you can smear my name because you've lost your mind?" But the room wasn't buying it. Gasps and murmurs grew. A woman near the back whispered, "I saw him at the barns that night." Another man nodded slowly, face pale. Mark Holloway stood, his voice cracked but carried. "I saw him with Lily too. I stayed quiet. I was wrong. But not anymore." The chapel erupted in voices, shock, denial, anger. The whispers Sam had chased for 10 years now roared into the open. Dalton's face hardened. "You'll regret this," he hissed, pointing at Sam. "All of you will." The pastor slammed his Bible shut, his voice trembling but firm. "Enough. This town will not hide behind silence any longer." He turned to the congregation. "This evidence will be delivered to the Attorney General. Justice will be sought." Dalton's fists clenched. His mask had cracked fully now, rage seething beneath the polished surface. Sam felt both triumph and dread. The truth was out, but the storm had only begun. After the service, the churchyard buzzed with voices. People clustered in small groups, arguing, questioning. For the first time, Dalton walked among them without total control. His smile was brittle, his handshake stiff. Sam stood by his truck, Mark at his side. Claire approached, her eyes fierce. "You did it," she whispered. "The silence is broken." Sam nodded, but his gut twisted. Lily's last voicemail replayed in his mind. "Don't trust anyone, especially him." His eyes scanned the crowd. Who was him? Dalton was obvious, but had Lily meant someone else, someone closer? Mark shifted uneasily beside him. "Sam, they'll come after you now. You know that." "I've been waiting 10 years, Sam said. "Let them come." He placed a hand on the notebook in his jacket. Hope's steady gaze flashed in his mind. But, just as resolve settled in him, a deputy approached. His uniform was damp with sweat, his eyes avoiding Sam's. He slipped a folded paper into Sam's hand. "Thought you should see this," the deputy muttered before walking quickly away. Sam unfolded it. Inside was a grainy photocopy security camera footage. The date stamp, the night of the fair. It showed a truck leaving the grounds near midnight. The license plate glared under the light, not Dalton's truck. Sam's blood ran cold. It was his own. Sam's breath caught, the paper trembling in his hand. He remembered leaving the fair early that night, searching for Lily. Had someone used his truck? Or had Lily been inside when it drove away? The congregation's voices blurred into static. Dalton's smirk, Mark's guilt, Claire's concern, all of it faded under the weight of the single question tearing through him. What if the silence wasn't just protecting Dalton? What if it was pointing back at me? Hope's distant whinny carried on the wind, sharp, urgent. Sam crumpled the paper in his fist, heart hammering. The whispers had broken open, but now they pointed straight at him. The photocopy shook in Sam's hand, as if the paper itself were alive. The black and white image blurred in the sunlight. His own truck, time-stamped the night of the fair. It was undeniable. The taillights, the plate number, it was his. Sam's breath hitched. The churchyard spun around him, voices rising in a storm of whispers that no longer seemed aimed only at Dalton. He felt their eyes sliding toward him now. Claire's voice pierced the fog. "Sam, what is it?" He folded the paper quickly, stuffing it into his jacket. Nothing, not here. But the sickness in his gut only deepened. Had he really driven away that night alone? Memory flashed in shards. Neon lights, the sound of Lily's laughter fading into the crowd, the frantic search through the barns. He had sworn he left without finding her. But what if memory had betrayed him? Don't trust anyone, especially him. Her voice echoed in his head, each word slicing deeper. Had she meant Dalton, or had she meant him? Sam climbed into his truck, fists tight on the wheel. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, pulse pounding, until the congregation thinned and Dalton's black pickup rolled past, the rancher's smile once again fixed, brittle as glass. Back at the farmhouse, the valley stretched quiet, but Sam felt hunted. He spread the photocopy across the kitchen table, next to the notebook and the USB. Pieces of truth and half-truth lay scattered like broken glass. Claire paced the floor. "Someone's trying to pin this on you." Mark sat hunched, eyes darting. "Or maybe you don't remember." Sam snapped his head toward him, fury sparking. "You think I took my daughter? That I harmed her?" Mark flinched. "No, I just mean grief, memory." His voice faltered. "It's what Dalton will say, that you drove her out yourself." The words cut deep because they carried the shadow of possibility. Sam slammed his fist on the table. "I would never." Hope whinnied sharply from the barn, as if echoing his vow. Claire leaned close, her voice urgent. "Then prove it. If your truck was there, someone else drove it. Find out who. That's the only way to clear yourself, and to find Lily." Sam stared at the photocopy until the ink bled in his vision. Then he rose. "Then I'll find whoever put her in that truck, or I'll die trying." That night, Sam returned to the barn. He carried the notebook, running his fingers over Lily's words again and again. Even silence has echoes. He whispered into the dark. "Echo for me, Lily. Tell me where you are." Hope shifted closer, pressing her muzzle into his shoulder. Sam closed his eyes, the sound of her breathing anchoring him. Suddenly, headlights swept across the barn wall. A vehicle crunched up the drive. Sam's heart kicked. He grabbed the rifle by the door, stepped out into the night. The same deputy from the chapel climbed out of a cruiser, his face shadowed. He held another envelope. "Found this in the archives," he said, his voice too calm. Sam took it warily. Inside were witness statements from the night of the fair. Most were vague, but one, written in hurried scrawl, froze his blood. "Saw a girl get into Whitaker's truck. Looked like Lily." Sam's knees weakened. He gripped the fence to steady himself. The deputy tipped his hat, eyes unreadable. Funny how things come back around. Then he turned, climbed into his cruiser, and drove off, leaving a trail of dust. Sam stood in the dark, the words burning in his hand. His own town, his own truck, his own name. Claire found him minutes later, still frozen. She read the statement, her jaw tightening. "They're framing you. Dalton's pulling strings." Sam's voice cracked. Or it's true. What if I—" "No," Claire snapped, grabbing his arm. "That's what he wants you to think. Don't give him that power." But doubt gnawed at Sam like rot. The next day, Sam walked into the Clearwater Library. Dusty silence greeted him, the smell of old paper thick in the air. He hadn't been inside in years. He sat at a table with the notebook spread open, the photocopies beside it, the USB drive waiting. Lily had written about whispers, about not being believed, about a man she couldn't name. But what if she had left more than whispers? Sam searched the archives, flipping through microfilm until his eyes blurred. And then, on a reel dated 3 weeks before her disappearance, he found it. A letter to the editor, unsigned. "There are men who feed this town poison. They smile in daylight and take in darkness. If anything happens to me, remember the horses. They listen when no one else will." Sam's heart raced. Horses. Hope. She had been leaving him a trail all along. He staggered out of the library into the fading sunlight. notebook under his arm, breath sharp in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt he was moving closer, not to silence, but to truth. That night, he sat in the barn with hope, the lamp burning low. He read Lily's words aloud, letting them fill the rafters. He let himself imagine her voice speaking them, steady and brave. "I'm coming for you," he whispered. "I don't care what it costs." Hope pressed her muzzle against his hand, steady and sure. Then, the phone rang again. Sam sprinted into the house, snatching the receiver. Static hissed. Then her voice, "Dad?" His knees buckled. "Lily?" The line crackled. "Don't let them turn you. You have to see." Her voice cut out, replaced by silence. "Lily, where are you?" Sam shouted into the phone. No answer. He dropped to his knees, the receiver clattering against the floor. Tears blurred his vision, but his heart thundered with certainty. She was alive. She was reaching for him. Morning broke cold and pale. Sam stood at the fence, watching fog drift over the valley. Hope stood beside him, steady as stone. The notebook lay in his pocket, heavy with Lily's truth. The USB was hidden safe. The photocopies weighed against his chest. He was armed with whispers, with echoes, with fragments of her voice. Dalton still ruled the town. The threats would keep coming. But Sam no longer stood alone in silence. He had hope. He had Lily's words. He had something stronger than fear. As he turned back toward the farmhouse, the wind carried a faint sound, so faint, he thought at first it was memory. A girl's laughter. He froze, heart in his throat. The sound drifted again, carried on the air, impossibly real. "Lily?" he whispered into the fog. Hope lifted her head, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. The laughter faded, swallowed by silence. Sam stood rooted, trembling. If she was out there, she was closer than he had dared believe. And if she was alive, then someone, somewhere, still held her. The valley lay quiet, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like a door, and someone, unseen, was waiting on the other side.